Thank you for the kind introduction. And thank you for having me. I wish I would have been able to attend this in person, but I'm glad you have the system set up to allow us to interact. So, over the past few years, I've been fascinated by what I call the many faces of sparse coding. And what I mean is the following. So, I have an interest that I can describe or that I can categorize in two broad classes. The first class of problems have to do with developing unsupervised learning algorithm based on deep learning to solve data analysis problems in neuroscience, as well as to understand things such as the principles of hierarchical sensory processing in the brain. Your next question, or your question should be, who does not today have an interest in utilizing deep learning for neuroscience? So what's so special or what's so unique about what I want to talk to you here about today? So another set of interests that I have is in the mathematics of deep learning. So I agree with Conrad that yes, you can put together neural network architectures and then train them, right? But right now, as far as I know, no one can tell you what happens inside a very large deep neural network. So I have an interest in developing what I call interpretable deep neural networks. So what connects these two seemingly disparate interests of mine? In my opinion, what connects them is what I call sparse coding or deep sparse coding. What do I mean? So today, we will go in detail to the first set of problems that I call blind source separation problems and how you design neural network architectures for those. What I mean is the following. That we record. The green time series you see is a recording from a single electrode in the brain. We're going to say that this recording comprises a certain number of neurons, two in this picture, whose activity occurs partially in time with some amplitudes and at times that we do not know. And starting from that statistical model, what I will show you today is a very precise prescription for how you turn that into the neural network architecture that is shown on the right-hand side. So this architecture takes the data Y as its input, and it tries to predict it as its output. We call this an autoencoder. We will go through the details of this in a second. What I want you to pay attention to is that everything in this architecture, the weights are specified from the statistical model. The nonlinearity here, which is called the ReLU, will come from an assumption of sparsity. I want to have time to talk about the second class of problems today, which is this idea of figuring out the principles of hierarchical sensory processing. But I've come up with a deep generalization of something that we're very familiar with in neuroscience, which is sparse coding that Olshausen and Field introduced us to. And I've come up with ways of taking that deep generalization and turning that into a very principled fashion into neural network architectures that you could train on natural image patches and could help you gain some insight as to what the principles of hierarchical sensory processing in the brain. So what am I really saying? What I'm saying is that, and this is particularly for the young researchers in the crowd, everybody wants to use deep learning right now in neuroscience, in science, and in diverse fields. I think we have a unique opportunity in neuroscience because of the history of our field in statistical modeling techniques such as sparse coding to utilize deep learning in what I call a principled fashion. So we have a unique opportunity to utilize deep learning in a principled fashion to develop what I call neural network architectures that are based on statistical model to solve source separation problems and problems of figuring out the details of how hierarchical sensory processing works in the brain. So without further ado, this is part talk, this is part of prescription or for a tutorial for how you actually design what I call these interpretable neural network architectures for discovering patterns in neural data. And for this purpose, I'm going to use a very simple problem that everybody in neuroscience, at least everybody that works with electrophysiology data, has familiarity with. That problem, we call it spike sorting. Okay, so here's a roadmap for what I will go through. We will start with electrophysiology data. So this recording from a single electrode in some brain region. And I only show you one electrode here to keep everything that I will say simple. Everything I will talk about today can generalize to cases when you have recordings from multiple electrodes. So we will call this time series Y, and we will do something very simple. So the mathematical model on the right-hand side here says something very simple that I can explain to you in words. It says that this time series is the superposition of capital C neurons. There's capital C neurons that are close to this electrode. Each of these neurons has a signature that I can put in this matrix H1 here. In linear algebra, we call this a topless matrix. So for H1, which characterizes the neural response associated with neuron 1, what the matrix H is the signature of that neuron at all possible delays. Well, that neuron will have activity at times and with amplitudes that are specified by a vector x1. By construction or by assumption here, this is a sparse generative model of your time series Y. And what I will show you over the next few slides is how do you take this and turn it into a neural network architecture that will help you do two things. This neural network architecture will not only have as its weight the signatures for each of the neurons. So once you train this architecture, it will converge to weights that you can associate with the signatures of neurons. And the hidden layers of this architecture, which I represent here by X capital T, solve the spike sorting problem for you. They tell you the amplitudes of events and they tell you when events occur. The nonlinearities in this architecture will come from our assumption of sparsity. So what I will give you is a prescription basically for how you can design a neural network architecture where everything you end up with in that architecture is under your control. You understand everything that is going on inside that blocks, as opposed to the de facto way of developing deep neural network these days, which I like to refer to as just connecting Legos together and hoping something good will happen. And once this architecture is trained, as you see on the left-hand side, you will have solved your spike sorting problem. My apologies, I'm trying to figure out the clicker here. So let's set up some notation or some language that we can use to talk together about how you go about designing these architectures starting from statistical models. So I have a simple example here for you where I have three neurons, a blue one, a red one, and a yellow one, each with its signature. This is the signature of spikes from this neuron as seen by an electrode. What I call these sparse codes, there's three of them, each associated with one of the neurons. These sparse codes tell me the location of events. X1 tells me the location of events from neuron 1, and the height of the bar tells me the amplitude of the events. For the sake of illustration, I've made the amplitudes roughly the same, but this generalizes to cases when the amplitudes are different. So we will use this as the basis of the next slide, which is this model for the data that you record at an electrode. So the data that you record as an electrode is this black trace, which I call y little n. And here is an index for discrete time. This is a sample index. What the equation on the right-hand side here says is that what you record is the superposition of those signatures for each of the neurons, convolved with the sparse codes for each of the neurons. And on top of that, you will see noise, of course. So what a convolution of the neural signature with the sparse code does is that it takes the neural signature, it puts it at the location where the sparse code is non-zero, and it scales it by the amplitude of the particular sparse code. So for the rest of the talk, it will be useful for us to express this in linear algebra notation. So my statistical generative model here. So what I want you to pay close attention to is that what I have here is a statistical generative model of the data that I record. Now, during the Q&A, we can talk about how reasonable this model is and what kind of assumptions we would like to have on this model. For example, you experimentalists out there will know that during the course of a recording, what I'm calling the signatures of the neurons, these HCs, may change over time. But this is something that we can actually bake into our statistical assumptions. So let's just start with this very simple model. We can write it in linear algebraic form as y equals hx plus a vector v of noise. What's our goal? Our goal, I'm having difficulties with the clicker here. Our goal, given this y equals hx equation, our goal is to solve for h and for X. And what we mean by H here is the signature for each of the neurons, as well as the location and the amplitudes of events, which will be given to us in the vectors X. Okay, now let me pause here for a second. So what I want to convince you in this slide is that y equals hx model, although I just developed it for you in the simple case of a recording from a single electrode, it is a pretty general and a pretty flexible model. That model, for example, generalizes well to the case where instead of recording a y of n, now you're recording at any given time, you're recording an image, something that has a spatial extent. So when you're recording with Neuropixels, for example, you have an electrode array that has an X and an Y extent, and on top of that, you're recording data over time. Well, how does my y equals hx model generalize to this case? It generalizes by virtue of the fact that now, instead of having one-dimensional convolutions, we now have three-dimensional convolutions. And you can incorporate prior structure that you see on the cartoon at the bottom right-hand side of the figure here, which basically says that the way to think about this three-dimensional generalization is that now each one of the black, purple, and green neuron has a signature over time, as in the earlier model, but it also has a spatial signature. So in other words, this is a very flexible model, and because of time, I cannot get into the details of this. This is a model that actually occurs in a lot of different places in science, not just in neuroscience. So how are we going to solve our problem? So the first thing I will do, and this is for data processing purposes, I'm going to take that y vector, which is my whole recording, and I'm going to break it up into capital J chunks. And now I'm going to solve what in one of the fields that I work in, signal processing, is called a convolutional dictionary learning problem. So we think of the matrix H as a dictionary. It's a dictionary of neural signatures. Because the relationship between y, h, and x is given by a convolution, we call it a convolutional dictionary. So our goal moving forward will be to solve this optimization problem. So what I claim is that if you could solve this optimization problem that says the following: in every window, I want to find a set of neural signatures and locations and amplitudes for events such that I minimize the error between my recording and my prediction based on the product of h and x, plus a term on the right-hand side, this lambda L1 norm of x, which promotes sparsity. This says, find me the neural signatures and sparse locations for events as well as amplitudes that explain my data the best. And for regularity conditions that I don't want to get into the details of right now, we need to put a constraint on the norm on how big these neural signatures are. And the value of lambda we pick, which in practice we will learn from data, dictates how sparse events will occur in the actual recording. How do you solve this in practice? So for those of you that are mathematically inclined in the audience, you will tell right away that this is not a convex optimization problem because you have a product of h and x. So what people do in practice is you alternate between solving h and solving for x. So suppose that somebody gives you a guess for these neural signatures. So those of you that do spike sorting on a daily basis, you could get this, for example, from a PCA on the neural data or on part of your neural data. Suppose somebody gives you a guess of the signatures. What would you do next? You would do something that we refer to in signal processing as convolutional sparse coding. If somebody gives me a guess of the matrix H, then the problem of finding the locations and amplitudes of events that are consistent with that guess, I can express as this optimization problem here. And what I want you to notice is that this optimization problem is independent over the capital J windows of my data, which means that it's embarrassingly parallelizable and is amenable to GPU processing. So one of the things that I want to claim is that everybody wants to use deep learning these days, right? In my opinion, I think that a lot of the things that we use deep learning to analyze data, we can already do without using deep learning. I think what deep learning can buy us has to do with the infrastructure that all these tech companies have developed that allow us to process data, for example, over GPU. What does that mean? This means that all of a sudden, we can process days, months of neural recordings, orders of magnitude, tremendously faster than we could without the infrastructure developed by all these tech companies. So basically what I'm saying is that I could solve the problem that I'm describing to you here without deep learning. But by turning it into a deep learning architecture, then I can take advantage of all this infrastructure that is developed by all these tech companies. So before I move on to, once you've updated your locations and events and amplitude consistent with your guess of the filters, how do you update your guess of the neural signatures? What I want to show you is that this optimization problem here, which looks very benign, this is sparse coding. There's a one-to-one mapping between this optimization problem and neural network architectures with ReLU nonlinearities. And we'll see this in the next slide. So the claim is the following. The claim is that, let's consider the first case where we assume that the signatures for each of the neurons are orthogonal to each other. That's what the equation H transpose H equals identity means. You can show mathematically that if you assume that the amplitudes of events are non-negative, the solution to this optimization problem is obtained by taking your data Y, projecting it onto the neural signatures, subtracting a bias lambda, and applying a maximum nonlinearity. So a one-layer neural network with ReLU nonlinearities solves this sparse coding problem when the signatures associated with each of the neurons are orthogonal to each other. Why is this cool? Because all of a sudden, I started with a statistical model, and I turned it for you inside the architecture, which means that when I train this architecture, I know what my weights mean. I know why I'm using this nonlinearity and no other nonlinearity, and so on and so forth. The second part of this slide is not as important. This is just saying that, for those of you, again, that are mathematically inclined, in such a case as spike sorting, where we cannot hope for the signatures to be orthogonal to each other, is because of the nature of the fact that our model has a convolution. So we not only have the signature for a neuron, we have delayed versions of it, which are going to introduce correlation. But it turns out that this argument that we can turn the solution to the optimization problem into a neural network with ReLU nonlinearities and weights that are determined by the model still applies. The only difference here is that our architecture now is going to be a recurrent neural network with tied weights. And for those of you that are interested in some of the mathematical details, what you do in this case is that you do gradient descent on the least squares objective. That's what's inside the parenthesis at the bottom of the slide. And then you do your nonlinearity. Now, so what I've discussed so far is if somebody gave you guesses of the signatures for neurons, how do you use that to update the locations of events and the amplitude most consistent with those guesses? Well, once you've done that, now you have to go now and update the signatures and do this process iteratively until you converge, which is the next slide. We call this a convolutional dictionary update. Now that I've found new locations and amplitude xj, I want to update the neural signatures h. This is the step that is typically computationally expensive. Why is it computationally expensive? Imagine your recording is over days. This step here is not parallelizable over the different recordings. The neural signatures are shared across all of the different windows of data. And again, we could incorporate here a constraint that the neural signatures should evolve over time. But the main point here is that this step is not parallelizable. But now, by turning it into the next slide that I'll show you into a neural network architecture, I can use stochastic gradient descent on batches to actually train this very, very efficiently. So what we will do next, and again, remember where I started. I had my time series recording. I started with a statistical model of it that encodes some assumptions, and you can pick the assumptions you want as long as you can encode them into statistical priors. And I've told you that doing that, you can turn this into a neural network architecture that solves the problem you were initially interested in. The problem that I was interested in is to learn the neural signatures H and to do spike sorting. Well, the architecture is what you see in this slide here. In deep learning, we call this an auto-encoder architecture. What the encoder does, the encoder does the sorting part. You give it the data, it takes the neural signatures using this gradient descent algorithm with a nonlinearity, but it outputs, it does the sorting for you. What the decoder does is that it takes the sorted data and uses the neural signatures to try and reconstruct your time series. In practice, how are we going to learn the weights? we're going to train this by backpropagation using the mean squared error loss. And what I want to show you in the next few slides is what happens when you do this. So here's what we did. We did something very simple. And again, so just for the sake of keeping things simple, I'm using simple examples. So here I simulated 3 sources, right, with some firing rates, sampling rates that are reasonable from the perspective of certain brain regions. Okay. What I will do next is I will train my architecture. And what this slide shows is that the architecture converges to the filters that you use to simulate the data. Let's look at what this figure says. On the y-axis, what I'm plotting is the angle. So I'm going to train my network by gradient descent. What that means is that it's an iterative algorithm that's going to successively refine your estimate of the filters. That's what is called this h hat of c. HC is the true filter that you use to simulate the data. What you're plotting on the y-axis is the sine of the angle between the filter you use to simulate, HC, and your estimate at every iteration of your algorithm. And what the x-axis represents is every iteration of your algorithm. What you want to see is that as your algorithm proceeds, if it's doing something that makes sense, the angle between the two should go to 0, so that the sine should also go to 0. And that's what you see in this slide. Why is this cool for me? And we have some theory to show that this works. This is cool because, to my knowledge, this is one of the first examples of a neural network architecture where I can actually exactly tell you what the weights mean. The weights here means the neural signatures that are associated with each of the neurons in my dataset. And you can generalize this idea again. Now, this slide here, I want you to focus on the last row of the table. What this shows is that this does sorting orders of magnitude faster than similar approaches that are based on this idea of using statistical model to solve these unsupervised learning problems in neuroscience. We do it in about less than a second for something on the orders of hours of data, while competing methods would have to take something like days to solve it. What the next slide shows you is something you saw at the beginning, which is that this approach actually performs sorting. And finally, I want to show you that it does this to an accuracy that is competitive with existing methods out there. What this plot shows is the trade-off between the number of spikes you miss and your number of false alarms. You want to be as close to the 0-0 corner as possible. So in the data that we use here, we had intracellular recordings from one of the neurons. So we had ground truth data. So the last thing I want to show you here before I conclude is that this idea that I just showed you of starting from statistical model and developing neural network architectures, you can apply this in many different settings. So in a collaboration with Venki Murthy's lab here at Harvard, we have been thinking about the following problems. So one of his students has these very interesting recordings in piriform cortex. So these are recordings from neurons in piriform cortex where an animal is trained to recognize order pulses, shown in red here, of different frequency. These are Poisson order pulses of different frequencies, and the animal is trained to recognize them. What you're seeing at the bottom left here is a raster. Now, what I want you to notice is that if you align the raster with respect to the order pulses, you get the figure that is next to it in black. It seems like every order presentation leads to a stereotypical pattern of spiking activity. Well, for me, what this means is that it means what's on the right-hand side here. I can use this to write down a sparse coding model now for the rate function of the neuron. My observations are y, which are now nonlinearly related to the rate function. They're Bernoulli. And the x here, again, tells me the locations and the amplitudes of events when one of the order pulses elicits spiking from the particular neurons. So cranking the same machine that I showed you, we can turn this into a neural network architecture for learning the impulse response associated with this neuron from the perspective of the rate function, as well as learning which order presentations elicit a response from the neuron. And what I want you to notice at the plot at the bottom left corner, which has the red and the black bars, is that not every order presentation elicits a response from the neuron. So that's the power of this approach, that it can let us learn not only impulse responses for neurons from binary spiking data in this example, but also which presentations of the stimulus elicit a response from the neuron. So to conclude, so what I tried to convince you of today is that we're uniquely positioned in neuroscience to design neural network architectures for answering interesting questions about how the brain does computation, but doing so in a principled manner. What I mean by a principled manner, we can start from statistical models and their deep generalizations such as sparse coding, which have a rich history in our field. Going as far back at least to Barlow's work, we can use this to develop now interpretable neural network architectures where everything inside the architecture is under your control. You understand everything that the architecture does. It's not a black box anymore. And basically what my talk was or is, it's a call for how we can utilize deep learning and neural networks in a principled fashion to solve pattern discovery problems in neuroscience. Those are the two problems that I discussed today, and something I could not touch upon today, but that you can find in some of my references at the end of the talk, is that you can use this to actually elucidate some of the principles that might underlie hierarchical sensory processing. And that work you can find in one of my papers that develops a deep generalization, a multi-layered generalization of Holzhausen field. Thank you for your attention.